Before the sun came up, someone pounded on my front door hard enough to rattle the windows. I opened it to find an eviction officer flanked by 2 police officers, holding a court order that said I had 24 hours to leave the lake house I'd lived in for 31 years. Across the street, my daughter-in-law's brother stood filming the entire thing on his phone, laughing, telling whoever was listening on the other end of that call that I'd finally gotten what I deserved. 3 weeks later, standing in that same house, I opened a folder in front of everyone celebrating my loss, and by the time I finished speaking, federal agents were putting handcuffs on the man who'd been filming me. Before I tell you exactly how a quiet, retired old railroad inspector took back everything that was stolen from him, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, and hit subscribe if you believe the truth always finds its way back to the person it belongs to. My name is George Whitman. I am 72 years old, and for 30 years I worked as a federal railroad inspector, spending most of my career crawling through rail yards and freight terminals across 4 states, examining everything from track integrity to the paperwork that kept an entire national transportation system honest. I started that career at 26 years old, a young man with an engineering degree and a stubborn insistence on doing things properly, and I retired at 56, with more commendations than I ever bothered displaying, and a reputation among the small community of federal inspectors who did this kind of work, as a man who simply could not be talked out of following a discrepancy all the way to its source, no matter how inconvenient that pursuit became for the companies being inspected. It was not glamorous work. Most people don't know inspectors like me exist at all, quietly checking bolts, welds, and inspection logs, the invisible layer of scrutiny that keeps trains from derailing, and companies from cutting corners. Nobody would notice until it was far too late. I learned early in that career that fraud almost never announces itself loudly. It hides in small inconsistencies, a date that doesn't quite match, a signature that sits half a degree off from every other signature in a stack of paperwork, a number that's technically correct but tells a story that doesn't add up when you look at the whole picture, instead of just one line of it. I carried a small leather notebook throughout my entire career, the same brand and style for 30 years, filling dozens of them with exactly the kind of careful, patient observations that would, decades later, prove essential to protecting my own home. My wife Margaret passed away 5 years ago from a heart condition that took her far too quickly. In the same lake house we'd bought together 31 years earlier, a modest 2-story home on the water, with a wraparound porch, Margaret had insisted on the day we first walked through it, telling me she wanted somewhere she could watch the sunrise every single morning for the rest of her life. I remember that first walk-through clearly, even now, Margaret practically pulling me by the hand toward the porch, before we'd even seen the kitchen, standing there with the morning light catching her hair, telling me with absolute certainty that this was the place, that she could already picture herself old and gray on that exact porch, coffee in hand, watching the water. I never once doubted her instinct on anything important in 36 years of marriage, and I certainly didn't doubt it that morning. That house held every meaningful memory of our marriage inside its walls. Our son Eric's childhood bedroom still upstairs, with the same faded blue wallpaper he'd picked out himself at 9 years old. Margaret's garden still blooming every spring along the side yard, exactly the way she'd planted it. Rows of tulips she tended every April, with the same devoted patience she brought to everything in her life. The dock where I still fished most mornings. Alone now, but never quite feeling alone with so much of her still present in every corner of that property. I had spent the 5 years since her death, slowly learning how to live inside grief, without letting it consume the rest of my days, finding a fragile but genuine peace in the routine of that house. Coffee on the porch each morning, fishing at the dock, tending the garden she'd left behind as carefully as she once had. And it was that fragile peace, more than anything material, that Trevor Mills and his associates had truly taken from me the morning they arrived at my door. I want to describe that dock for you, because it matters to understanding exactly what was at stake, beyond the simple financial value of the property. Margaret and I had built it together during our second summer in the house. A modest wooden structure extending maybe 20 feet into the lake, sturdy enough that I'd reinforced it myself twice over the decades, using the same careful attention to structural integrity I brought to my professional inspections. I fished from that dock most mornings, not always catching anything, not particularly caring whether I did, simply sitting in the same folding chair Margaret had bought me for my 60th birthday, watching the water, feeling closer to her there than almost anywhere else on the property. It was on that dock, 3 years after her passing, that I finally allowed myself to fully accept she was gone, sitting alone one October morning, watching the mist rise off the water, exactly the way she used to describe loving most. And it was on that same dock, I would later learn, that Trevor had posed for his mocking photograph, casually claiming a space that held more meaning for me than he could possibly have understood, or, I suspect, cared to understand. Eric is 38 years old, my only child, a good-hearted man who has always struggled, in ways that used to worry Margaret more than they worried me, with an eagerness to please people who didn't always deserve his trust. As a boy, Eric was the kind of child who gave away his lunch to classmates who claimed they'd forgotten theirs, who apologized first, even in disagreements that weren't his fault, who seemed constitutionally incapable of believing that people close to him might not always have his best interests at heart. Margaret used to say he had inherited her tender heart without inheriting enough of my stubborn skepticism to balance it out. And though I loved that quality in my son, I had privately worried for years that it would eventually be exploited by someone who recognized it for the vulnerability it sometimes became. He married a woman named Vanessa Mills 6 years ago, a wedding Margaret unfortunately did not live to see. And while Vanessa herself always treated me with a kind of distant politeness, careful and correct but never quite warm, her family, particularly her younger brother Trevor, never bothered to hide their opinion that Eric had married slightly above his station, and that I, a retired government inspector living modestly on a pension, represented exactly the kind of unremarkable, unambitious life they hoped Eric would eventually distance himself from. Vanessa's parents ran a moderately successful chain of car dealerships across 2 counties, and family gatherings on their side always carried an undercurrent of financial one-upmanship that I found exhausting even in small doses. Conversations dominated by whichever relative had most recently purchased a boat, a vacation property, or some other visible marker of success. I remember one particular Thanksgiving, roughly 2 years into Eric and Vanessa's marriage, when Trevor made a comment, ostensibly joking, about how nice it must be for me to have found a lake house before property values in the area really took off. The implication clear even beneath its casual delivery, that my home represented an asset to be evaluated, and perhaps eventually acquired, rather than simply a place where I had built an entire life with the woman I loved. I hadn't thought much of that comment at the time, dismissing it as the kind of tone-deaf remark wealthy young men sometimes make, without fully considering how it lands. Looking back now, with everything I eventually learned about Trevor's actual profession and his involvement in the fraud network targeting elderly homeowners, I understand that comment for exactly what it likely was: an early, exploratory probe into whether I represented a viable target. I want to walk you through the morning everything changed, because I remember every detail of it with a clarity that still unsettles me. It was not yet 6 in the morning when the pounding started at my front door, hard enough that I came downstairs still in my robe, my heart already racing before I'd even seen who was there. My bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. Margaret and I had refinished together during our 2nd year in that house. The lake outside my window sat perfectly still in the gray pre-dawn light, the same peaceful view I'd woken up to for 3 decades, utterly indifferent to what was about to unfold on my front porch. I opened the door to find a county eviction officer standing beside 2 uniformed police officers, all 3 of them wearing the careful, practiced neutrality of people who do this exact job, often enough that another old man's shock no longer registers as anything unusual to them. One of the officers, a younger man who couldn't have been much older than 30, avoided meeting my eyes directly, and I remember noting, even in my confusion and fear, that at least one person present seemed to understand this situation carried more weight than a routine procedural matter. The eviction officer held out a folded document and informed me, in the flat procedural tone government employees use when delivering news they didn't create and can't undo, that I had 24 hours to vacate the property at 118 Lakeshore Drive, per a valid court order stemming from a legal transfer of ownership that had occurred, according to the paperwork, nearly 4 months earlier. I stood in my own doorway, in the house I had lived in for 31 years, the house where I had watched my wife take her final breath in the bedroom just above where I now stood. And I read those words twice before I could even begin to process what they meant. My hands, I noticed distantly, had begun to shake, the same document trembling slightly as I tried to focus on words that simply refused to make sense arranged in that order. I told the officer there had to be some mistake, that this was my home, that I held the deed myself, my voice coming out smaller and more uncertain than I wanted it to. 30 years of federal authority suddenly meaning nothing at all, standing barefoot on my own porch. He simply gestured toward the document, told me I was welcome to contest it through the courts, and reminded me, not unkindly but firmly, that the timeline on the order was not something he had the authority to extend. It was then that I noticed the young man standing across the street, phone raised, recording the entire exchange with an expression I can only describe as gleeful. Trevor Mills, my daughter-in-law's younger brother, 29 years old, had apparently arrived early enough to watch the entire humiliating scene unfold from a comfortable distance, and as the officers turned to leave, he called out loud enough for me and the entire quiet street to hear. "Finally got what was coming to you, old man." He laughed, said something into his phone that I couldn't quite make out, clearly narrating the moment for whoever was on the other end of that call, and then climbed into his car and drove away without another word, leaving me standing alone in my doorway holding a document that claimed my home no longer belonged to me. I sat down at my kitchen table that morning, hands still trembling slightly, and read through every page of that eviction order with the same methodical patience I'd applied to 30 years of railroad inspection reports. The pre-dawn light had shifted to full morning by the time I finished my third pass through the document, my untouched coffee gone completely cold beside me. Buried in the legal language was a reference to a sale agreement dated nearly 4 months earlier, transferring ownership of 118 Lakeshore Drive from my name to an entity called Lakeside Property Holdings LLC, an organization I had never heard of, and had certainly never signed any document authorizing. I remember the particular, sinking clarity of that moment, understanding that whatever had happened to my home had been set in motion months earlier, quietly, entirely without my knowledge, while I continued living my ordinary life completely unaware. The signature on the recorded transfer document. When I finally located a copy through the county recorder's office later that same day, driving there still somewhat in shock, my hands unsteady on the wheel the entire way, bore my name in a hand that looked close enough to my own signature to fool a casual glance, but that I recognized immediately, with the same trained eye I'd used to catch falsified inspection logs throughout my career, as a careful, practiced forgery. The pressure was too consistent, the letter formation too deliberate, missing the small natural variations that appear in genuine handwriting, produced quickly and without conscious thought. I had spent 30 years teaching myself to notice exactly this kind of discrepancy, and standing in that county records office, staring at a signature designed specifically to fool someone who wasn't looking as carefully as I was, I felt something harden inside me that had nothing to do with the grief and confusion I'd woken up with that morning. I called my son that afternoon, my voice steadier than I actually felt, and asked him directly whether he knew anything about a sale of my house. Eric's silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough to answer the question before he even spoke, a silence I recognized instantly as the particular quality of a man who has been dreading exactly this conversation for some time, and is only now realizing it can no longer be avoided. When he finally responded, his explanation came out in a rushed, anxious tumble. Something about a temporary investment arrangement Vanessa's family had proposed months earlier. A way to optimize the property's value, while I continued living there rent-free. Paperwork, he admitted, with visible shame creeping into his voice even through the phone. That he'd signed on my behalf, using a power of attorney I'd given him years earlier, for medical emergencies only. Paperwork he swore he'd barely read, because Vanessa's father had assured him it was simply a formality to help secure a business loan. "Dad, I promise this isn't what it looks like. Everything's going to get sorted out, it's just temporary, I swear." I could hear, underneath his rushed reassurances, a genuine desperation that told me my son believed, at least partially, in what he was telling me, that some part of him still trusted the family he'd married into, even as the rational part of his mind must have already been recognizing how badly he'd been used. I did not believe him, not because I doubted my son's love for me, but because 30 years of reading fraudulent paperwork had taught me that men who genuinely believe an arrangement is temporary and harmless do not typically use an elderly medical power of attorney to secretly transfer someone's home into an LLC nobody in the family had ever mentioned before. I told Eric I needed time to think. hung up the phone, and sat alone in my kitchen for a long while, staring at Margaret's garden through the window, watching a hummingbird visit the same feeder she'd hung 15 years earlier, understanding with a growing, cold certainty that something far larger than a simple family misunderstanding was unfolding around me. I called Helen Brooks that same evening. Helen had spent nearly 25 years as a title fraud investigator for the county recorder's office before her own retirement 3 years earlier. And during the final decade of my career, our paths had crossed regularly on joint investigations involving fraudulent property transfers connected to railroad right-of-way disputes, cases where unscrupulous developers attempted to seize land through falsified paperwork. Nobody bothered to double-check. Helen was, without question, one of the sharpest investigators I'd ever worked alongside. A small, precise woman in her late 60s who had built a reputation, during her career, for catching fraud schemes that other investigators dismissed as too complicated or too subtle to pursue seriously. I remembered, from our years working together, her particular gift for seeing patterns across seemingly unrelated documents, connections other people simply didn't have the patience or the training to notice. Helen and I had developed, over those years, a professional respect built on the shared understanding that most people simply trust documents far more than documents deserve to be trusted, and that catching fraud required exactly the kind of patient, detail-obsessed scrutiny most people considered tedious. We had stayed loosely in touch since both our retirements, occasional phone calls, a holiday card each December, the kind of friendship built on mutual professional respect that doesn't require constant maintenance to remain genuine. Helen listened without interrupting as I explained everything. The eviction order, the forged signature, Eric's confession about the power of attorney. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before saying exactly what I needed to hear. George, if what you're describing is real, this isn't some isolated family dispute. This has the fingerprints of an organized operation all over it. I've seen this exact pattern before. A family member with legitimate but limited authority, a document scope quietly exceeded, an LLC nobody's heard of, suddenly holding title. I want you to send me copies of everything you have tonight, and I want you to call your old friend Walter Higgins first thing tomorrow morning. If anyone still practicing real estate law understands how to unwind something like this properly, it's him. I spent that final night in my own home, packing what I could into boxes, moving slowly through rooms filled with 31 years of memory, taking down photographs of Margaret from the hallway, wrapping the ceramic bowl she'd made in a pottery class decades earlier, folding the quilt she'd sewn for our 40th anniversary, carefully boxing up the small leather notebooks from my career that I still kept in the study closet. I did not cry that night, though I came close more than once, standing in our bedroom doorway, remembering the exact spot where I'd held her hand during her final hours, the late afternoon light falling across the bed, in the same particular way it always had, indifferent to everything that was happening to the man now standing in that doorway. Instead, I focused on the practical work of documenting everything, photographing every room, every piece of furniture, every detail of a house I fully intended to reclaim, no matter how long it took, treating my own home, in that strange and painful moment, exactly like any other inspection site I'd ever needed to document thoroughly. By the following afternoon, I had relocated to a small rental cabin, roughly 15 minutes from the lake house, a modest single-room property I found through a listing Helen helped me track down quickly, owned by a retired couple who asked no questions and required no lengthy application. Exactly what I needed given the circumstances. I remember standing in that cabin's small kitchen that first evening, looking around at unfamiliar walls, feeling the particular disorientation of a man in his 70s, suddenly displaced from the only home he'd known for 3 decades, and deciding, in that quiet moment, that I would not let that disorientation curdle into despair. I had spent 30 years methodically uncovering fraud hidden inside official paperwork. I intended to apply every bit of that training to getting my home back. The cabin itself was simple, a single room with a small kitchenette, a modest bathroom, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Nothing at all like the home Margaret and I had built together, but sufficient for what I needed during those weeks. I brought only a handful of belongings from the lake house, a few photographs of Margaret, my collection of leather notebooks from my career, a single quilt, deliberately keeping my presence there minimal, treating the space more as a temporary field office than a home, exactly the way I once approached temporary lodging during long inspection assignments decades earlier. Every morning during those 6 weeks, I woke before dawn out of habit, made coffee on the cabin's small stove, and spent the early hours reviewing whatever new documentation Helen or Walter had sent overnight, treating my own displacement with the same disciplined structure I'd once brought to active federal investigations. I will admit, honestly, that there were nights during that period when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm the careful composure I tried to maintain during the day. I remember one evening in particular, roughly 3 weeks into the investigation, sitting alone in that small cabin with a photograph of Margaret in my hands, allowing myself, finally, to grieve not just her absence but the violation of the home we'd built together. The sense that even the physical space holding her memory had been stolen from me by people who saw it as nothing more than an asset to exploit. I cried that night in a way I hadn't allowed myself to since her funeral, and then, the following morning, I got up, made my coffee, and returned to the careful, patient work of taking my home back, understanding that grief and determination were not mutually exclusive, that I could hold both at once, and let each one strengthen the other, rather than canceling each other out. Walter Higgins, the real estate attorney Helen had recommended, agreed to meet with me the following morning, and within the first 20 minutes of reviewing the documents I brought him, he confirmed what I already suspected. Walter's office sat above a small bakery downtown, unglamorous but reassuringly practical, filled with the kind of overstuffed filing cabinets that suggested a lawyer more interested in doing thorough work than projecting an image of success. He was in his late 60s himself, a soft-spoken, thorough man who had handled property disputes across the county for nearly 4 decades, and he listened to my entire account without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad in handwriting nearly as precise as my own inspection logs had once been. The power of attorney Eric had used to authorize the sale had been explicitly limited, in the original document I'd signed years earlier, to medical and healthcare decisions only, containing no language whatsoever granting authority over real estate transactions. Walter pulled out the original document I'd brought, along with the sale agreement, laying them side by side on his desk, tracing his finger along the relevant clauses in each. "George," Walter told me, tapping the document with visible frustration, "whoever drafted this sale agreement either didn't bother reading the actual scope of your power of attorney, or they were counting on the fact that most people never check that closely. Either way, this transfer has a serious legal vulnerability, and I intend to build our case around exactly that." He leaned back in his chair and added, more quietly, "In 38 years of practicing real estate law, I've seen maybe a handful of cases this cleanly exploitable, in favor of the original owner. Whoever structured this scheme was either sloppy or arrogant, and either way, that works in your favor." I asked him honestly how long a case like this typically took to resolve, bracing myself for an answer measured in years rather than months. Walter was careful in his response, telling me that emergency motions could move relatively quickly, but that fully unwinding a fraudulent transfer and pursuing criminal charges against the parties responsible could take considerably longer, particularly if the scheme extended beyond my own case, as both of us already suspected it might. "The important thing right now," he said, "is stopping that eviction and beginning to document everything properly before anyone involved has a chance to destroy evidence or cover their tracks further. Everything else, we build methodically from there." Helen, meanwhile, had begun her own quiet investigation into Lakeside Property Holdings LLC, the entity now claiming ownership of my home. Using contacts she'd maintained from her decades at the county recorder's office, she discovered that the LLC had been formed only 5 months earlier, with a registered agent address that traced back to a small office suite shared by nearly a dozen other similarly named shell companies, all of them formed within the same 18-month window, all of them connected through overlapping filing addresses and a single law firm that handled their paperwork. Helen called me into her home office roughly 2 weeks into our investigation, a corkboard she'd set up much the way I remembered federal investigators organizing evidence during my career. County property records connected with string to LLC filings, connected in turn to a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Her office, a converted spare bedroom in the modest ranch house she'd lived in since her own divorce years earlier, smelled faintly of the same strong coffee she'd always favored during our joint investigations. And I remember standing in that doorway for a long moment, simply absorbing the scale of what she'd already assembled in such a short time. printed county records, LLC formation documents, and a hand-drawn map of overlapping filing addresses stretching across nearly the entire board. "George," she said, tapping a cluster of documents near the center of the board. "Every single one of these properties belonged to homeowners over the age of 70. Every single transfer happened through a power of attorney or a family member's signature on documents the original owner apparently never saw. This isn't one bad actor taking advantage of your family situation. This is a system targeting elderly homeowners specifically, run by people who understand exactly which legal loopholes to exploit." She walked me through each property individually. An elderly widower in the next county over, who'd lost his home 18 months earlier. A retired school teacher, whose daughter had unknowingly signed away her mother's property under nearly identical circumstances to Eric's. Each case following the same careful, repeatable template: a family member with limited legal authority manipulated into exceeding that authority, a shell company formed specifically to receive the transferred title, a rapid resale or refinancing that extracted value from the property before the fraud could be discovered. I stood beside that corkboard for nearly an hour that evening, reading through case after case, feeling the particular cold clarity I remembered from the most significant investigations of my career. The sense of watching an entire hidden system reveal itself piece by careful piece. "How long has this been running?" I asked her, and Helen's answer, when it came, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my own situation specifically. "Based on the formation dates of the earliest shell companies I've found so far, at least 3 years, George. Possibly longer. And nobody's caught it yet, because every individual case looks, on its surface, like an unfortunate but ordinary family dispute, rather than part of something larger." At the center of that system, according to records Helen pieced together over the following days, sat Trevor Mills, my daughter-in-law's brother. Trevor, it turned out, worked as a junior associate at a small real estate investment firm that, on paper, specialized in distressed property acquisition, but that Helen's research suggested functioned primarily as the recruitment and paperwork arm of a coordinated scheme targeting elderly homeowners with family members who could be pressured, deceived, or simply relied upon to sign documents without reading them carefully. Trevor's role, based on internal emails, Helen's contact was able to access through a subpoena connected to an entirely separate ongoing investigation into the firm, involved identifying vulnerable targets specifically through personal relationships, elderly parents and grandparents of friends, co-workers, and family members, exactly the position he occupied in relation to me. I remember sitting across from Helen that afternoon, absorbing the full scope of what she'd uncovered, feeling something shift inside me from simple anger into a colder, more focused resolve. Trevor had not stumbled into targeting my home by accident. He had identified me, specifically, as an easy mark the moment his sister married my son, understanding exactly how to manipulate Eric's eagerness to please Vanessa's family into unwittingly signing away his own father's home. Helen showed me one particular internal email, dated nearly a year before the eviction, in which Trevor described me to a colleague as a soft target, widowed, isolated, sentimental about the property. Language so clinical and calculating that I found myself needing to set the printout down and step away from Helen's desk for a moment before I could continue reading. "He'd been watching for the right opportunity for a year, George," Helen told me quietly. "This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a young man making one bad decision. This was patient, deliberate targeting, and your grief over Margaret, the fact that you lived alone, that you clearly loved that house more than almost anything else in your life, all of that was information he used against you, rather than something that should have made him more careful." Walter, working alongside Helen's findings, discovered additional evidence that deepened the picture considerably. The sale agreement transferring my home had included a wire transfer, supposedly representing payment for the property, that traced back through 2 intermediary accounts to a shell entity Helen had already flagged as connected to the broader network. A transfer designed to create the appearance of a legitimate transaction, while the actual funds simply cycled back to accounts controlled by the same small group of people running the scheme. Walter walked me through the mechanics of it one afternoon at his office, sketching a simple diagram on a legal pad to help me visualize exactly how the money moved. "It's designed to look clean on a cursory review," he explained. "Money goes from account A to account B, appearing to represent a legitimate purchase. But account B is controlled by the same people who control account A, just through a different shell entity. Anyone glancing at county records sees a completed sale. Anyone tracing the actual money, the way Helen has, sees it's the same pocket the whole time. I asked Walter, somewhat naively I'll admit, why such an elaborate scheme was even necessary if the goal was simply stealing property from vulnerable homeowners. Couldn't they have simply forged the deed transfer without bothering with the pretense of a sale at all? Walter shook his head. A deed transfer with no sale attached raises immediate red flags with the county recorder's office and with any title company doing due diligence down the line. But a documented sale, even a fraudulent one, provides a paper trail that looks legitimate on its surface. It's more work, but it's also much harder to unwind once it's completed, which is exactly why these people were confident enough to celebrate, rather than worry about being caught. In total, Helen's research eventually identified 11 separate properties across the county that had been acquired through nearly identical methods over the preceding 2 years, each one belonging to an elderly homeowner, each one involving a family member manipulated into signing documents they either didn't fully understand or hadn't been given adequate opportunity to review. Over the following weeks, working alongside Helen and Walter, I began the careful, methodical process of building a complete case, applying the same disciplined patience I'd relied on throughout my entire railroad career. Walter filed an emergency motion to stay the eviction, pending a full investigation into the validity of the power of attorney used to authorize the sale. A motion the court granted within days once the limited scope of the original document became clear, allowing me at minimum to delay any further action against the property while our investigation continued. I did not move back into the house immediately, choosing instead to remain in the small rental cabin, understanding that appearing to still be displaced would keep Trevor and his associates comfortable, confident, and far less cautious than they might otherwise be. I visited Eric several times during those weeks, partly to maintain the relationship I still desperately wanted to preserve despite everything, and partly, I'll admit honestly, to gather what information I could about Vanessa's family, without revealing how much Helen and I had already uncovered. I remember one visit in particular, sitting in Eric's living room while he paced anxiously near the window, still under the impression that our conversations were simply a father trying to process a painful family misunderstanding, rather than active intelligence gathering for a formal investigation. I asked careful, seemingly casual questions about Trevor's job, about how often he visited, about whether Eric had ever met any of Trevor's business associates. And Eric, desperate for some outlet to process his own guilt and confusion, answered more openly than he probably would have if he'd understood the full weight of what I was actually building. During one of those visits, Eric mentioned, without any apparent understanding of its significance, that Trevor and Vanessa's parents were planning a celebration at the lake house, a housewarming gathering, to mark what they considered the successful completion of their investment, inviting extended family and several of Trevor's business associates to see the property firsthand. I remember sitting across from my son at his kitchen table, keeping my expression carefully neutral, my coffee cup steady in my hand, despite the sudden acceleration of my pulse, understanding immediately that this gathering represented exactly the kind of opportunity Helen and I had been waiting for. I asked him casually when exactly this celebration was planned, and Eric, still oblivious, told me the date without hesitation, a piece of information that would prove absolutely critical to everything that followed. I want to acknowledge something honestly here, because I think it matters to the full picture of what those weeks actually cost me emotionally. Sitting across from my own son, extracting information from him without revealing my true purpose, felt, at times, uncomfortably close to the same manipulation that had been used against both of us. I struggled with that discomfort more than once during those visits, questioning whether the ends truly justified treating my relationship with Eric, even temporarily, with a degree of strategic distance I wasn't accustomed to using with my own family. But Helen reminded me, during a phone call after one particularly difficult visit, that protecting Eric fully required understanding exactly how deep Vanessa's family's involvement actually ran. Information Eric himself, still trusting, and still processing his own guilt, couldn't reliably provide, if he understood I was building a formal case, rather than simply working through grief alongside him. Trevor, during this period, made no effort whatsoever to hide his contempt for me. He'd taken to posting occasional comments on social media that Eric, uncomfortable but unwilling to confront his brother-in-law directly, eventually showed me, joking references to downsizing help for stubborn old-timers, and, in one particularly galling post, a photograph of himself standing on my own dock, captioned simply, "The Good Life." I remember scrolling through those posts on Eric's phone, feeling a cold, controlled anger settle over me, rather than the hot, reactive fury I might have expected. The same particular discipline I'd relied on decades earlier, standing in freight yards confronting executives who'd tried to bully their way past a failed safety inspection. Trevor had also posted a photograph of a small gathering at the house, clearly an earlier, smaller preview of the eventual celebration. Several of his business associates visible in the background, unknowingly providing me and Helen with additional faces to cross-reference against the growing list of names connected to the shell company network. He seemed to view the entire situation as settled, a done deal, an old man too tired and too outmatched to mount any real resistance. And every dismissive comment, every casual cruelty, only strengthened my resolve to make sure the resolution landed with maximum impact when it finally came. I mentioned this pattern to Helen during one of our regular evening calls, and she reminded me of something I already understood deeply from my own career. George, men like Trevor build their entire confidence on the assumption that nobody's paying close enough attention. Every one of those posts he's making, every boast, is just more evidence stacking up against him. Let him keep talking. He's building our case for us. Helen, working with a private investigator she trusted, from her years in the field, a quiet, careful man named Ray Delacroix, who had spent his own career specializing in financial fraud surveillance, arranged for careful surveillance and documentation of several meetings between Trevor and his associates at the small office suite tied to the shell company network, capturing conversations that, once properly obtained through methods Walter confirmed would hold up legally, revealed Trevor discussing the scheme with a casualness that suggested he genuinely believed himself untouchable. Ray worked from a parked van across the street from that office suite for the better part of 2 weeks, documenting comings and goings, cross-referencing license plates against names Helen had already flagged, slowly building a visual map of exactly who belonged to this operation and how frequently they met. In one recording, captured during what appeared to be a routine planning meeting between Trevor and 2 of the associates who would later be arrested alongside him, Trevor could be heard laughing about how easy I had been to remove from the property once his sister's husband had been convinced to sign the necessary paperwork, describing me, chillingly, as just another old guy who won't know what hit him until it's too late. In a separate recording, captured nearly 10 days later, Trevor discussed a second, upcoming target, an elderly widow in a neighboring county whose son, according to Trevor's own words, trusts his in-laws even more than mine does, language that made clear this was neither an isolated incident, nor a scheme limited to my family alone, but an ongoing, deliberate operation, actively identifying its next victim, even while celebrating its success against me. Helen also uncovered, during this period, financial records showing that Trevor personally received a payment of nearly $60,000 following the completion of the sale agreement for my home, funneled through the same shell company structure, disguised in internal records as a consulting fee, for services that, according to Helen's research, corresponded to no legitimate consulting work of any kind. This detail, more than almost anything else uncovered during the investigation, confirmed for Sergeant Alvarez's team that Trevor's involvement went well beyond simply facilitating a family betrayal out of misplaced ambition. He had been paid, directly and substantially, for his role identifying and helping to execute the theft of my home specifically. I want to be honest about how difficult those weeks were, listening to recordings of a young man mocking my displacement from the home, where I'd buried my grief for Margaret, watching Trevor's casual cruelty documented in his own words, and learning that at least one additional elderly homeowner somewhere nearby was likely being targeted at that very moment, unaware, exactly as I had been, of the danger closing in around them. But 30 years as a railroad inspector had taught me something valuable about patience, under exactly this kind of pressure, that the men who rush their response before the evidence is complete almost always end up with a weaker case than the men who wait, gather everything, and strike only when the outcome is already secured, beyond any reasonable doubt. Walter, working closely with a contact he maintained at the county's Financial Crimes Division, formally referred the entire case roughly 5 weeks after that first morning at my door, presenting a complete file that included the falsified power of attorney documentation, Helen's mapping of the shell company network across 11 properties, the wire transfer records showing funds cycling back to accounts controlled by the scheme's organizers, and the recorded conversations documenting Trevor's explicit knowledge and participation in targeting elderly homeowners. The lead investigator assigned to the case, a methodical detective named Sergeant Diane Alvarez, spent nearly 2 full days reviewing the material before confirming what Walter and Helen had already suspected, that this qualified as an organized elder fraud operation serious enough to warrant coordinated action across multiple agencies, including the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit and the state's Consumer Protection Division. I met Sergeant Alvarez in person for the first time during a meeting at Walter's office, roughly a week after the referral. A sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, who reminded me, in her careful, methodical way of working through evidence, of some of the best federal investigators I'd partnered with during my own career. She spent nearly an hour going through the timeline with me directly, asking precise questions about specific dates, specific conversations, occasionally cross-referencing something I said against a document already in the file to confirm consistency. "Mr. Whitman," she told me near the end of that meeting, "I want to be honest with you. Cases like this, involving elderly victims and family manipulation, are some of the hardest to prosecute successfully, because juries sometimes struggle to understand how someone could be victimized by their own family without realizing it in real time. What you and Ms. Brooks have assembled here is about as clean and thorough a case file as I've seen in 15 years working economic crimes. That gives us a real chance to not just recover your property, but to actually shut down the entire network." Sergeant Alvarez explained during our final planning meeting that moving too early, before the network's full scope could be documented, risked allowing the remaining organizers to destroy evidence or disappear entirely, the same concern Helen had voiced from the very beginning. She walked me through the broader strategic picture, explaining that her department had actually received 2 prior unconnected complaints from other elderly homeowners in the county over the preceding year, complaints that had gone nowhere due to insufficient evidence, but that now, cross-referenced against Helen's shell company mapping, appeared to be additional victims of the exact same network. "You may not realize it, Mr. Whitman," she told me, "but your case is likely going to become the anchor that finally lets us connect dots we've been unable to connect for over a year." When I mentioned the upcoming celebration Trevor and Vanessa's family were planning at my own lake house, meant to mark what they believed was the successful, permanent completion of the scheme, Sergeant Alvarez recognized immediately the opportunity it presented. If they're gathering the key people involved in one place, celebrating, feeling secure, that's exactly the kind of moment that makes coordinated arrests significantly easier and significantly safer for everyone involved, she told me. "But Mr. Whitman, I need to ask you directly, are you comfortable walking into that gathering yourself? Nobody would think less of you for letting us handle the arrests without your presence." I told her, without hesitation, that I intended to be there. 30 years of federal inspection work had taught me that the people who built fraudulent systems needed to see, clearly and unmistakably, that the person they'd underestimated was the very person who brought their entire operation down. I owed that much to Margaret's memory, to the home we'd built our life inside, and honestly, I owed it to myself. The celebration was scheduled for a warm Saturday afternoon, roughly 6 weeks after that first terrible morning, and word reached me through Eric, still unaware of the full scope of what Helen and Sergeant Alvarez's team had uncovered, that Vanessa's family had invited nearly 40 guests, extended relatives, neighbors from the lake community, and several of Trevor's business associates from the firm connected to the fraud network, all gathering to celebrate what they believed was a completed, unchallengeable acquisition of my home. I did not sleep well the night before that celebration, if I'm honest, lying awake in that narrow cabin bed running through every possible way the following day could unfold, worrying, despite everything Sergeant Alvarez had reassured me about her team's readiness, that something might go wrong, that Trevor might somehow slip away, that the confrontation I had spent 6 weeks carefully building toward might collapse into chaos, rather than the clean, undeniable resolution I had worked so hard to construct. I spent that final evening reviewing every document in the manila folder I would carry with me the following day, checking and rechecking that everything was organized in exactly the sequence Walter and Sergeant Alvarez had recommended. The legal findings first, the shell company network second, the recordings last, building toward the moment of maximum impact rather than front-loading the most damning evidence too early. I thought about Margaret that night more than I had in months, wondering what she would have made of the entire situation, and I found myself, somewhere in the early hours of the morning, speaking quietly to her photograph on the small bedside table, telling her I was going to get our home back, that I wasn't going to let anyone take away the life we'd built together without a fight. I don't know that I believe, in any literal sense, that she could hear me, but saying those words out loud, alone in that small cabin, gave me a particular kind of steadiness I carried with me the entire following day, a sense that I wasn't walking into that confrontation alone, whatever the truth of that feeling actually was. I arrived at my own lake house that Saturday afternoon, dressed simply, carrying a plain manila folder under my arm, walking up the same gravel driveway I'd walked thousands of times over 31 years. The house looked almost unbearably familiar and strange at once. String lights Vanessa's family had added, strung across the porch railing. Margaret herself had chosen. Unfamiliar patio furniture, arranged where our old wicker chairs used to sit. Small changes that somehow stung more than I expected. Evidence of strangers already reshaping a space built entirely around my late wife's careful vision. Guests mingling on Margaret's porch, the same porch she'd insisted on all those years ago, fell into an uneasy, whispering silence as they noticed me approaching. Several of them clearly recognizing me, but unsure how to react given whatever version of events Trevor's family had been circulating. Likely some story about a difficult, unreasonable old man who'd simply needed to be removed from a property he could no longer properly maintain. Trevor himself stood near the dock, drink in hand, holding court with a small group of his business associates, and when he spotted me walking up the driveway, his face broke into the exact same mocking smile I'd watched through his phone screen 6 weeks earlier. I noticed Vanessa standing near the kitchen door, her expression harder to read than Trevor's, something that might have been discomfort flickering briefly across her face before she composed herself. Eric stood near the porch steps, and even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the particular stiffness of a man caught between loyalties he hadn't yet fully sorted out for himself. "Look who decided to show up," Trevor called out, loud enough for the gathered guests to hear, gesturing toward me with his drink. "Come to see the new owner's housewarming, old man. Bold move." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through a few of his associates, though I noticed several of the actual family members present, including Vanessa's own mother, looked distinctly less amused, glancing between Trevor and me, with expressions I couldn't quite read, perhaps beginning, even then, to sense that something about this entire situation had never sat entirely right with them either. I walked calmly onto my own porch, found Eric standing near the door looking pale and uncertain, and I asked, in a voice that carried across the gathered crowd without needing to be raised, whether I might say a few words before the celebration continued. Trevor, clearly enjoying what he assumed was about to be a pathetic, easily dismissed plea from a defeated old man, gestured expansively for me to proceed, telling his associates this would be worth watching, a comment that drew a few more uneasy laughs from his circle, though noticeably fewer than his earlier remark had. I opened the manila folder and began speaking, my voice steady, procedural, the same tone I'd used delivering findings during 30 years of federal inspections, a tone I had used to inform railroad executives that an entire freight line needed to be shut down for safety violations, a tone that had never once wavered, regardless of how powerful or dismissive the audience receiving it happened to be. I explained, first, the basic facts, that the power of attorney used to authorize the sale of this house had been legally limited to medical decisions only, a detail Walter had already confirmed in writing with the court. I watched Trevor's smile falter slightly, though he still seemed confident, clearly assuming this represented, at worst, a legal technicality his associates could eventually work around. Then I began reading from the second section of that folder, the findings Helen had spent weeks assembling. I named Lakeside Property Holdings LLC and its connection to 10 other identically structured shell companies. I described the pattern across 11 properties, each one belonging to an elderly homeowner, each one acquired through a family member manipulated into signing documents under false pretenses. I mentioned specifically the elderly widow in the neighboring county that Trevor had discussed as a future target, watching several of his associates exchange nervous, sideways glances as they realized exactly how much detail this supposedly harmless old man had managed to gather about their entire operation. I watched the color begin draining from several faces among Trevor's business associates, as they realized, in real time, exactly how much had already been documented about an operation they'd assumed remained completely hidden. I saved the recordings for last. I played, from a small speaker Helen had helped me set up discreetly near the porch railing, a clip of Trevor's own voice, captured weeks earlier, laughing about how easy I had been to remove from my own home, describing me as just another old guy who won't know what hit him until it's too late. I let that recording play in full, every word landing across the silent porch. And then, deliberately, I played a second clip, the one in which Trevor discussed his upcoming target in the neighboring county. His casual, business-like tone describing another elderly homeowner's vulnerability, with the same detached cruelty he'd shown discussing mine. The porch fell into complete silence. Guests who had been laughing along with Trevor only minutes earlier, now staring at him with open horror, several already pulling out their phones, though this time not to laugh, but to quietly begin recording something they were only now beginning to understand. Trevor's face had gone completely white, his earlier confidence collapsing into something desperate and cornered. He started to speak, some fragmented attempt at explanation or denial, and that was the exact moment Sergeant Alvarez and her team, who had been waiting discreetly in unmarked vehicles down the Lakeshore Road for nearly 20 minutes, moved up the driveway. Uniformed officers and detectives from the Economic Crimes Unit moved through the gathered crowd with practiced efficiency, and Trevor Mills was placed in handcuffs on the same dock where he'd once posed for a mocking photograph, along with two of his business associates who were identified and detained separately as key participants in the shell company network. Vanessa's mother, standing near the porch railing, pressed a hand to her mouth in visible shock, while several other guests simply stood frozen, watching a celebration transform into a crime scene in the span of a few minutes. Someone dropped a wine glass near the far end of the porch, the sound of it shattering against the wood, strangely loud in the sudden stillness. A woman I didn't recognize, one of Trevor's business associates' wives perhaps, quietly gathered two young children who'd been playing near the dock and began walking them toward the parked cars, clearly wanting to remove them from whatever was unfolding as quickly as possible. I noticed Vanessa herself standing motionless near the kitchen door throughout the entire sequence, her face a mixture of horror and something that looked almost like relief, as though some part of her had long suspected her brother's business dealings carried a darkness she'd never allowed herself to examine too closely. I did not gloat. I have never found satisfaction in another person's downfall, even a person who had shown me nothing but casual cruelty for weeks. I simply stood on my own porch, in the house where I had loved my wife for 3 decades, and watched justice arrive exactly the way I had spent 30 years of my career ensuring it eventually did, through patience, documentation, and an unwillingness to accept fraud, simply because the people committing it assumed no one was paying close enough attention. I remember looking out at the lake beyond the dock, the same water Margaret had loved so completely, and feeling, for the first time in 6 weeks, something close to peace settling over the chaos still unfolding around me. Eric found me near the porch railing, once the initial chaos began to settle, his face carrying an expression of shame, so complete it nearly matched my own grief from 6 weeks earlier. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking, "I never meant for any of this to happen. I trusted Vanessa's family. I didn't read what I was signing carefully enough. I know that's not an excuse, but I need you to know I never wanted to hurt you." I looked at my son, at the genuine anguish written across his face, and I told him the truth, that I believed him, that I didn't think for a moment he had acted out of malice, but that trust, once broken through carelessness this significant, doesn't repair itself simply because the person responsible feels sorry. I told him that if he wanted to rebuild what had been damaged between us, it would require more than an apology. It would require him demonstrating, over time, through consistent action, that he understood exactly how much his carelessness had cost, and that he was willing to do the harder work of earning trust back, rather than simply expecting it returned. Eric nodded, tears in his eyes, and told me he understood, that he was prepared to do whatever it took, starting with formally testifying, if needed, about how the falsified power of attorney had been used against him, and against me both. His willingness to cooperate fully with Sergeant Alvarez's investigation, rather than protecting Vanessa's family out of misplaced loyalty, became, over the following weeks, the first real evidence that my son intended to follow through on that promise. The court proceedings that followed over the next several months confirmed everything Helen, Walter, and Sergeant Alvarez's team had uncovered. The sale agreement, transferring my home, was formally voided due to the limited scope of the original power of attorney, and ownership of 118 Lakeshore Drive was fully restored to my name within 10 weeks of that Saturday afternoon confrontation. I remember standing in Walter's office the day the final paperwork came through, holding a document that legally confirmed what I had known to be true since that first terrible morning. Feeling something in my chest finally loosen after months of carrying a tension I hadn't fully realized I'd been holding, until it began to release. Trevor Mills and his 2 business associates were charged with multiple counts of elder financial fraud, forgery, and organized property theft, charges that, combined with the broader investigation into the remaining 10 properties across the county, ultimately implicated several additional individuals connected to the shell company network, including the attorney who had drafted the fraudulent paperwork for all 11 transactions, a man named Gerald Finch whose license to practice law was permanently revoked once his role in the scheme became clear. Sergeant Alvarez's earlier instinct proved correct as well, my case becoming the anchor that finally allowed her department to connect the 2 previously unresolved complaints from other elderly homeowners, both of whom were eventually able to reclaim their properties as part of the broader prosecution. The elderly widow in the neighboring county that Trevor had been recorded discussing as a future target was contacted proactively by Sergeant Alvarez's team before any scheme could be executed against her, sparing her entirely from the ordeal I had endured. Sergeant Alvarez told me, during our final follow-up meeting, that the case against Trevor and his associates had become one of the largest coordinated elder fraud prosecutions the county's Economic Crimes Unit had handled in over a decade, directly recovering nearly $4 million in stolen property value across every victim involved. Trevor ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial, receiving a sentence of 8 years, along with mandatory restitution that, combined with the other defendants' penalties, contributed meaningfully to the broader recovery effort for all 11 affected families. Eric's marriage to Vanessa, I should mention honestly, did not survive the fallout from that Saturday, the 2 of them separating within 4 months. Vanessa's own relationship with her brother becoming, from what Eric later told me, deeply strained once the full scope of Trevor's manipulation of her own husband became undeniable even to her. In the months following the trial, I made a decision that I believe Margaret would have understood completely, perhaps even expected of me. Rather than simply reclaiming my home and moving forward quietly with my own life, I used a portion of my retirement savings, along with a modest settlement I received as part of the broader fraud case, to establish the Margaret Whitman Legal Aid Center, a small nonprofit offering free legal consultation and document review specifically for elderly homeowners concerned about potential fraud, staffed initially by Walter himself on a volunteer basis, and, eventually, by 2 additional attorneys who reached out after hearing about the case through local news coverage of Trevor's prosecution. Helen agreed to serve on the center's small advisory board, bringing her decades of title fraud investigation experience to help train volunteers on exactly the kind of red flags most people never think to look for until it's far too late. Within its first year of operation, the center reviewed documents for over 200 elderly homeowners across the county, identifying and helping to prevent, according to Walter's own tracking, at least 6 additional attempted fraud schemes before they could be completed. Eric began volunteering at the center himself, roughly 8 months after that Saturday confrontation, spending Saturday mornings helping process intake paperwork and, over time, taking on a more substantial role, helping educate families about the exact kind of power of attorney limitations that had been exploited in his own carelessness. I watched my son, slowly and deliberately, turn the worst mistake of his life into something that actively protected other families from suffering the same fate, and I began to understand, watching him do that work, that the trust between us was rebuilding itself exactly the way I had told him it would need to, through consistent, demonstrated action rather than words alone. I still live in the lake house today, back on the same porch Margaret loved so completely. watching sunrises the way she always wanted to for the rest of her life. A promise the house itself, in a strange way, helped me keep, even through everything that tried to take it from me. I replaced the string lights and unfamiliar patio furniture Trevor's family had added, restoring the porch, piece by careful piece, to exactly how Margaret had once arranged it. The same wicker chairs, the same simple potted plants along the railing, a small act of reclamation that mattered more to me than I expected it to. Eric visits regularly now, and slowly, carefully, over many months of consistent effort on his part, our relationship has begun rebuilding itself on steadier ground than it stood on before, my son having learned, at considerable cost, exactly how much careful attention the people we love actually deserve from us. I think often about that morning the eviction officer knocked on my door, about Trevor standing across the street laughing into his phone, about how completely he believed an elderly widower represented an easy, forgettable target, rather than a man who had spent 30 years learning to catch exactly the kind of fraud he was attempting. I think about how close this could have ended differently, if I had simply accepted the eviction, too overwhelmed by grief and confusion to fight back, too willing to believe that a court order, however fraudulent its origins, represented something final and unchangeable. I think, too, about that elderly widow in the neighboring county, spared entirely from an ordeal identical to mine. A reminder that patience and thoroughness protect not just the person directly targeted, but often the next victim waiting quietly in line, who never even knows how close they came to losing everything. A signature can take a house away from a man in a single afternoon. But the truth, given enough patience and enough careful attention, always finds its way back to the person it actually belongs to. That has been true in every fraudulent inspection report I ever caught during 30 years of railroad work. And it proved true again in the home where I built my entire life with the woman I loved. I hope, if you're watching this and something in your own life feels the same way mine did that morning, unfair, overwhelming, impossible to fix, that you remember patience is not weakness. Sometimes it is simply the quietest, most powerful form of justice there is. I sit on that porch most mornings now, coffee in hand, watching the same sunrise Margaret loved so completely. And I think about how easily this could have ended differently. If I had simply believed, that first terrible morning, that the paperwork in that officer's hands represented something final and unchallengeable. If I had let grief and shock convince me that fighting back wasn't worth the effort at 72 years old. If I had trusted, even for a moment, that a man as confident and dismissive as Trevor Mills couldn't possibly be caught by an old retired inspector nobody took seriously anymore. Every one of those assumptions would have been wrong, and every one of them is exactly what men like Trevor count on when they choose their targets. I was never as powerless as he assumed, and neither, I suspect, are most of the people watching this story who feel, right now, like the world has quietly decided they no longer matter enough to fight for. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe the truth always finds its way back to the person it belongs to, hit subscribe to Humble Dad Stories. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you.